Hello whisky fans, welcome back. We're on some Norfolk whisky today. This is Norfolk whisky from my local home distillery here in Norfolk, which is St George's, or also known as the English Whisky Company these days. But this isn't their normal line of single malt whiskies, because they are known for single malt. They produce whisky kind of roughly in a Scotch style. But what we've got here, these aren't single malt whiskies. Obviously, the definition of whisky that we're governed by here in England is different to what they have in Scotland, but what you've got at the moment is a situation where, because the laws are a little bit lax, a lot of distilleries are choosing to follow the same guidelines as laid down in the Scotch Whisky Regulations 2009. So with these whiskies here, because they're not what you would call a single malt under the Scottish law, they've bottled these as single grain whiskies. So obviously the single means that it's the produce of one distillery, and grain because all of these whiskies are made with at least one thing which is not malted barley. And what you've actually got with all of these releases, these three I'm not looking at today. These ones are quite old. These were from several years ago. I think they started in 2016 and 17. But all of these whiskies, these single grains from the Norfolk English Whisky Company, they're all made with multiple grains. They are all pot still whisky. So none of the whisky at the English Whisky Company is made with continuous stills. So it's kind of the opposite situation with what you've got at Loch Lomond. With Loch Lomond single grain whiskies, they're actually taking 100% malted barley and they're running that through continuous stills, which is why they're not allowed to call it single malt, because single malt has to be malted barley in pot stills. Whereas what you've got here with the English Whisky Company, it's all made in pot stills, but the mash bill not being 100% malted barley is what means that this is grain whisky. And I think that's really interesting. When you think about the difference between pot stills and column stills often, it's kind of a triple distillation on steroids. It's because you've got constant distillation in there. It produces a very light, very, very refined whisky, which often ends up a bit light on flavour. So, as we all know, grain whisky is something that's becoming slowly more popular. It's getting a little bit more exposure. People are kind of getting behind it, especially because of what you're getting from companies like Loch Lomond. They're doing a great job. And also Compass Box with their various grains and blended grains. But if anything, I think that what the English Whisky Company are doing with a mixed multi-grain mash bill and still putting it through pot stills the proper single malt way is probably more interesting and has even greater potential than the already great products that we're getting from people like Loch Lomond. And I'm really disappointed in a way that this line of whiskies that the English Whisky Company have made and their single grain stuff, it's all bottled under the moniker of the Norfolk. I'm really disappointed that these things aren't getting more attention, because there's a lot of innovation going on out there in Norfolk, and they're producing some really great stuff, really interesting things that you're probably not getting from any other distillery. I think that a lot of these whiskies, they're a style of whisky using mash bills, really complicated mash bills in some cases, that have probably never been available commercially from any other distillery ever. In particular, this one here, which is actually my favourite of these three old bottlings, the Norfolk Farmers release, it's actually made with a mash bill of 7 different grains, which is then run through their pot stills. Now, that's amazing. As far as I'm aware, that's not something that has been available from any other distillery. But as I said, we're not looking at these older releases today. What we're looking at today is a fairly new release. It came out a little while ago, last year, from the English Whisky Company, but you will still be able to find some of this online if you do want to try it. And that's the Norfolk 9yo Rye Whisky. So the first question that everyone is going to have with this one is, WTF is going on with that label? So I'm going to do my best to explain. I'm going to keep it brief so I don't bore you. But the label on this one, the hat, is actually because the bowler hat was invented in Norfolk. So it was originally invented as a horse riding hat, believe it or not, and it was kind of something for people on shoots and when hunting on horseback to wear to protect their head from getting bashed by twigs and tree branches and stuff as they're riding through woodland. So it was something that was popular with the rural working classes back when it's invented. It's actually originally known as a coke hat or a cook hat, named after the person that kind of pioneered its invention. And I find this really interesting. If you look at a lot of old photos of kind of American frontier pioneers, the first people that went out to the United States to live in the early colonies, a lot of those early photographs, you'll actually see that they're not wearing Stetsons. A lot of them are actually wearing bowler hats, these old-fashioned traditional original coke hats or cook hats. And that's because the image of the cowboy in the Stetson is really largely a creation of Hollywood. As for why it's a seal, I have no idea. We do have seals in a lot of places on the coast here in Norfolk, so maybe that's a little connection there, although the English Whisky Company is probably about as far inland as you can get without leaving Norfolk, so I'd be very surprised if they've ever seen any seals out there in Rowden. You'll probably also notice that the old bottles had a cat in a bowler hat. Why was it a cat? Again, no idea. Good label though. I really love the presentation on these, which is why these are all second or third bottles here. These are all still sealed. I will open them at some point, but that's why I've still got a full collection of these original Cat in the Hat bottles, because I just think they're really nice little bottles. So going back to the bottle that we're looking at today, the Norfolk Vintage Single Cask Single Grain Whisky, aged 9 years, rye whisky. We've got quite a lot of details on the label of this one. It's bottled at a really healthy drinking strength of 51.4% ABV. So that's not cask strength. And a lot of you are going to think, why 51.4%? And I bet that a lot of others out there are going to think that that's a really familiar number, because it's the same ABV that they bottle Ardbeg Ugadal at. And that's not a coincidence at all, because 51.4% ABV works out at exactly 90 UK proof. For anyone that finds these things interesting, Ardbeg Corryvreckan as well, that's bottled at 57.1, which works out as 100 UK proof. These numbers are not random. Other details that we've got on the label from this Norfolk 9-year-old rye whisky. It's 9 years old, obviously, and it's matured in bourbon casks and virgin oak casks. It's also a limited batch of 442 bottles, so this is truly small batch. Some distilleries, their idea of what they call a limited edition or small batch can be anywhere from 5,000 to 30,000 bottles, and they'll still say that that's a small batch. So the fact that there's only been 442 bottles of this means it really is small batch. We also know that this one is made with a mash bill of 55% rye. So let's get some in the glass, see what we've got. We'll also mention that all of these Norfolk single grain whiskies from the English Whisky Company, they do sadly come in 500ml bottles, which is a good and a bad thing. It's bad that you're getting less, and it means that so you're effectively paying more per dram than if you got a full-size bottle. But it's also good in a way, because you get to try something that you might not be sure of. It lets you try something at a slightly more affordable price. And to be fair, the price on all of these is, I think, pretty reasonable, considering that you're getting a full craft presentation, because they do all state that they're non-chill filtered. And again, I contacted the English Whisky Company and they promised that all of their whisky is natural colour as well. So that's fantastic. The price that you have to pay for these, I think this one was about £60-65. I think that these ones, I've had them for a long time, but they were a little bit cheaper, because these are only 45% ABV. So all in all, not too bad price-wise. So the English Whisky Company Norfolk Single Grain Whisky, Single Grain Rye Whisky on the nose. So probably about what you would expect for a 55% rye whiskey, matured at least partly in virgin oak. It's hugely oaky. There's a lot of spiciness on the nose of this one, getting strong notes of oak, raw oak, sawdust, freshly sawn oak. There's also a little bit of a sort of astringent, woody, chewed pencil note on the nose. But that's not all you're getting. You're getting some really nice flavours coming through from the spirit itself. I'm pleased to say that it's a very fatty and oily whiskey. Getting a nice aroma of sesame seed oil on the nose of this one, as well as a nice lemoniness and some grassy hay aromas. So I think that a lot of people, if you tried this blind, I can see it throwing a lot of people for a loop because it's a confusing, unique type of whiskey. But I think a lot of people would identify this as a rye whiskey. Let's see how it tastes. So on the palate of this one, lovely, dense, intense flavours, beautiful oily coating mouthfeel, and a lot of that is undoubtedly from that really good bottling strength of 51.4 ABV. Flavours on the palate, getting some really nice astringent oak, not overly woody or spicy, but there's definitely a strong presence from that oakiness. Getting some more musty lemon notes, a little bit more grassiness, lots of fresh oakiness, flavours coming through from the oak. There's lots of oak spice, so ginger, cardamom, as well as a really nice berry sweetness, perhaps something like a musty blueberry note. But it really is all tied in with that spicy, grassy rye notes and that fresh virgin oak. Something else that's worth mentioning with this one is that it is a whiskey that takes water incredibly well. If you add a little bit of water to this, it really starts to open up really nicely. In particular, once you add water to this, it does tend to tone the oak down a little bit. So if you do find that virgin oak is too much, then adding a little bit of water is a nice way to tone that down a little bit. Once you've watered it down, you get more notes of sweet, creamy, lemon fondant flavours. And I think that, interestingly, once you add some water to this, those 9 years of maturation do really start to show. I'd actually say that this is the most mature rye whiskey that I've ever tasted. As for the finish, medium long, lots of oak spice and more of that berry sweetness. So all in all, I think this is a really well made whiskey that I'm pleased to say really showcases all of those flavours from the rye and that virgin oak, as well as the pot stills. Saying that, rye whiskey finished in virgin oak is not immediately my kind of thing. I do think that rye whiskey, it's deservedly its own authentic category of whiskey. It's got big potential, but it's not everyone's thing. I think especially if you are a single malt drinker, this is the kind of thing that you kind of have to go to as a novelty, and you have to have a little bit of an open mind. As far as rye whiskey goes though, if it's something that you want to branch into, and especially if you are a fan of English whiskey and supporting English distilleries, I think this is a fantastic one to try. Another thing that I need to mention with this 9-year-old rye whiskey from the English Whiskey Company is that, from my experience, it does massively improve with a little bit of time and air. When I first got this whiskey and I first opened it and tried it, I wasn't that thrilled when I first cracked it, but over time it's really grown on me, especially after being left uncorked for a few hours and getting some air and oxidation to it. It's without a doubt one of the best rye whiskies I've ever tried. So as for a grade, it's hard to judge these things when you're judging something which is so different to what you're primarily interested in, which for me is Scotch single malt and, to a lesser extent, English single malt whiskies, but I'm going to give this one a B-. One thing that I do really appreciate with this whiskey that I've mentioned earlier in the review is that I do really appreciate all of that innovation that the English Whiskey Company are doing with this and all of their grain whiskies. There's so much that you can do with whiskey. There's an entire world of spirits that you can make if you branch out from that narrow mindset of pot stills, double distillation, oak casks, and purely 100% malted barley. If you open yourself up to 1, 2, 3, 4 of those other options that you've got out there, there's an entire world of flavours that you can create that we just don't see. I do admittedly agree that I think that single malt whiskey made with 100% malted barley in pot stills and oak casks, that probably is the pinnacle or one of the pinnacles of what you can do with distilled beverages, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try other things. And that really leads me back to this one. I've probably mentioned this one before in other reviews. The first single grain whiskey that the Norfolk English Whisky Company did was this Farmer's release at 45% ABV, and this is probably my favourite that they've done so far in terms of grain whiskies, because this one was made of a mash bill of 7 different grades run through their pot stills, and I think that this is something that more people need to try. There is a new batch of this coming out, and hopefully I'll get hold of some of that. I'll be able to do a review of that. But I think that especially that broad spectrum multi-grain mash bill through pot stills, huge potential there. As for this one, the whiskey that we're actually looking at today, the 9yo Rye whiskey, I think this is a fantastic effort. It's really interesting, and especially if you're the sort of person that likes bourbons and rye whiskies from the States, this is probably something that's going to appeal to you. Another probably unintentional benefit of a whiskey like this 9yo Rye whiskey from the English Whisky Company is that it's fantastic for home blending. A lot like the Highland Park cask strength, I think that that punchy virgin oak and rye spice in this whiskey, it just adds that much body to anything that you add it to, that you can really use this to add to any other whiskey, and you kind of end up with a cask strength quarter cask version of whatever you add it to. So let's do a little home blending here. I think probably everyone that's only got a casual interest in these reviews has probably left after the first quarter of an hour, 20 minutes of me waffling on about cats in hats and bowler hats and all that. So probably all the die-hard anoraks that are left. So we've got a reasonable amount of the 9yo Rye whiskey in there. Let's see what we can add to it. So first of all, I do prefer my whiskies on the slightly sharper side. I think that the amount of oak and spiciness that you get on this one, it's fine, it's pleasant, it's good, it's interesting, but I like a little bit of sharpness. So first thing I'm going to add, Filey Bay, which is another English whiskey, English single malt. There will be a review of this one coming out very soon, probably won't be out by the time that I release this video. But interesting with this one, this Filey Bay would not be classed as single malt if it is released in Scotland, because they actually have a column still as part of the process in this whiskey. But because we're not bound by those Scotch whisky regulations that they have in Scotland here in England, we can call this a single malt. And I think that will be fantastic. Probably added about half as much of the Filey Bay as I had of the rye whiskey. But I think that will be fantastic to add a little bit of sharpness and a little bit of focus. And finally, this is something that I tried before I started recording this video, and it's something that I think worked incredibly well, and it's a little bit counterintuitive. What I'm going to do here is kind of top dressing with this Glenfiddich. This is one that I probably will release the video for this before this one comes out, so you've probably seen my review of this one. It's the Glenfiddich Fire and Cane. But normally when you're talking about top dressing with a whiskey, you're probably more often than not talking about the really good stuff, probably older, hand-picked, cherry-picked casks of really good whiskey to give a little boost to some more run-of-the-mill whiskey. So you usually would not be talking about top dressing with a 43% ABV Glenfiddich. But I think that this one, because it's got that little bit of sweetness from the rum casks and a reasonably heavy dose of peat, considering that this is a 43% Glenfiddich, I think this is going to be a really good one to top dress or blend. And I'm probably going to be sparing with this one because I think that even though it's only 43%, it's probably going to be quite easy to overdo this one. So there we have it. Whisky Lock, one of a kind, first of its kind ever home blend. I've probably got about 50% of the rye cask there, maybe 30% Filey Bay, and the remaining 20% from the Glenfiddich peated rum cask. Let's just have a quick look at what we've got here. So, what would you call this? Well, it's got to be a blend now, I think, because we've got some grain whisky and some single malt, and a single malt from England, which wouldn't be a single malt in Scotland. So it's getting quite complicated, but obviously you can't call it Scotch. But whatever it is, it's certainly unique. So on the nose, getting a big boost of sharp lemony sweetness coming through from the Filey Bay. Lots of body and oak spice coming through from that 9-year-old Norfolk Rye whisky. And just a tiny little hint of the peat coming through from the Glenfiddich. And I think probably a little bit of sweetness coming through from that rum cask as well. But I think if you hadn't had the rye cask in there, if you just had the 46% Filey Bay and the 43% Glenfiddich, it would have nowhere near the depth or presence or complexity, or more importantly the body that you're getting carrying through from that rye whisky. Fantastic. As per the nose, really getting lots of sharp juiciness, body, and just that little interesting sort of accent from the peat coming through from the Glenfiddich. So, hope you've enjoyed this one. Hopefully I haven't gone on for too long. Let me know in the comments what you think about rye whisky, what you think about English whisky, and what do you think about things like this from the English Whisky Distillery, because 442 bottles of this, and from experience of the other single grain whiskies from the same distillery, they don't sell out quickly. So even though I think that this is really interesting, you're getting some really innovative and new things, people obviously don't talk about it and they don't really buy it. But I really think that they should. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.